I just found out about some more new information, this time from the Ice Age farmer that I didn't know about. As we all know, there was Event 201, which was in, I believe, October or November of last year. And it was a total made-up event. Like, everyone was fake. They're all reading off teleprompters. They're all reading off scripts. And they're basically saying, hey, if by chance there was a coronavirus pandemic, how would we handle it? And they're like, well, first thing, we got to make sure no one on the internet can talk about it. Got to wipe out all fake news. Then we got to get the anti-vaxxers. We got to put in basically martial law, police state, and all these sort of things. So that was Event 201. So we know all about that. A lot of people have talked about that. But I was not aware that in 2015, John Podesta was involved in an event called Food Chain Reaction. And they were planning for a major food chain supply event to happen in, drum roll please, 2020. You can't make this stuff up.
In fact, there's a period called the Holodomor War back in 1932, where the Soviet Union had expanded west, took over Ukraine, and they weren't fond of the communist government there. And so what happened? Well, it was a man-made famine that killed, according to some estimates, between 3 to 12 million people. Now, why did they? You can see it's known by a few different names here. It translates directly as to kill by starvation. This was a mass murder. In fact, it's genocide by many definitions. Now, many academics and analysts are quite certain this is open and shut. The Soviet communist leadership used this man-made famine to attack Ukrainian nationalism, to break down those people, to starve them out until they submitted to this new communist leadership, the Soviets. That is exactly what's happening now. In fact, we read very briefly, how did that play out? Well, the Soviet communist government came in and they just totally took ownership of the farms. They kicked the farmers off, and then they mixed up what crops were planted where, which knocked production down. And then beyond that, we see significant amounts of grain was left unharvested. And even when it was harvested, we lost a lot. It was just poor administration. We didn't have plans. It was just, communists. They suck. What can you say? I want to bring up one man. That man is John Podesta. Why would we start with John Podesta, who's obviously deeply entrenched and disgusting within the Democratic establishment? It's because several years ago, he hosted an event, his Center for American Progress, which is funded by George Soros, hosted an event called the Food Chain Reaction Game. Now, the Food Chain Reaction Game, much like Event 201, was a simulation. It was a group that posited 5 years from then, in 2020, as it turns out, there would be massive disruptions to the world food supply, and they would need global governments to solve these problems. By the way, the website, foodchainreaction.org, has just been taken down, perhaps because we're entering into the real-life version of the events that they simulated. But you can still find it here on archive.org. We can read, Food Chain Reaction Game is a simulation, a role-playing exercise intended to improve understanding of how governments, institutions might interact to address a crisis in the global food system. Here's a brief clip that even mentions that it's a result of a pandemic.
Around the globe, food prices have risen about 40% in the last year.
Severe drought in the Horn of Africa has reached famine conditions.
Violence breaks out in Somalia as demonstrators protesting rising food prices clash with police.
We are facing a humanitarian problem.
So somehow the Food Chain Reaction Game, much like Event 201, somehow foresaw a coronavirus outbreak in the near future. Food Chain Reaction Game somehow foresaw massive disruptions to the food supply due to a pandemic in 5 years. And they saw it 5 years ago. It's just somehow that happened. Again, this was an event sponsored by Cargill and Mars, multinational, big ag and big food companies, and also the World Wildlife Fund, who we know, and the Center for American Progress by John Podesta. John Podesta remains tightly knit with this Democratic establishment. We've seen him talking about Biden's campaign strategy and his economy, and he even recently turned heads when he role-played Biden in a mock 2020 election and refused to concede, citing disenfranchised minority voters. Ladies and gentlemen, that hasn't happened yet. What's going on? Why is John Podesta playing out? He seems to be very fond of role-playing in these scenarios where there are both disruptions to the 2020 election and massive food supply problems, hunger. Somehow it's almost like we're walking in to the world that he has scripted for us.
Yeah, so they were planning for all this, and man, this food supply chain stuff, this is going to become huge. And by huge, I mean horrible. And by horrible, I mean famines in a lot of areas of the world, food shortages, massive increase in the price of food, mostly because of what the central banks have done, but also, so they're increasing the money supply, but decreasing the food supply. This is setting up for, as the Ice Age farmer was talking about, something similar to what they call the Holodomor. I don't know where they got that word. Sounds sort of like out of Lord of the Rings, but these sort of Bolshevik types, which is, if I have to use a word to describe what's going on more than anything, it's Bolshevism. And they use these tactics all the time. In fact, the World Health Organization's person is a communist. He's from the Communist Party or something in Ethiopia. A lot of these guys are. The UN guy, the guy who sounds Russian, but he's not. He's like a total commie. Like they're all commies. They've taken over all this stuff. And one of their big tactics, and Henry Kissinger has said this before, if you control the food, you control the people. So this is gonna, over the next probably year or so, I don't know how long it'll take, but definitely within the next year, gonna see massive price increases. We're already seeing the food banks in the US. Just look up any recent information. It's literally miles and miles of people in their cars waiting, hoping to get some food. And this is before the food supply shortages have really started.
Lines are stretching for miles in state after state as the millions of Americans now living on the edge are facing disruptions in the food distribution chain.